G'day legends, I hope that you've had a fantastic weekend and a good start to the week. Now, this week is a very important week in the Ukraine-Russian war. Of course, with the money being held up in the US Congress, and of course into next year, we don't know how this week will go, if Ukraine will be granted more military aid money. Of course, that is being held up in Congress because it's part of a package for Israel, Ukraine. There's a bit for Taiwan, but also for the southern border, and they can't reach an agreement on this. Now, I do believe that an agreement will be came to by the end of the week, but there has been some interesting quotes at the moment saying that maybe it'll go into next year. But as we know, Ukraine's military aid is really running on fumes, and some will say that this is a change in the war, that we are seeing a shift by the West for not wanting to send more money in. Is it? Isn't it? Well, we will see that unfold over the next 6-12 months and see where this war goes. But if this money doesn't get approved, then that's definitely not a good sign. But I saw this last week, and this is something that I really wanted to actually speak with you guys about, was the ISW, the Institute Study of War, who we've spoken about a fair bit on this, has put out a thing, or put out an analysis called The High Price of Losing Ukraine, talking about the price that America could pay for Ukraine actually losing. And of course, America has interest in Ukraine. This is, people say this conspiracy, that's just bullshit to say that it's not. Ukraine's interest in Ukraine is not only for protecting democracy, freedom, people, but at the same time, we've seen other wars like this where US has had nowhere near this much involvement. Why are we seeing it here? Well, because our greatest adversary over the past decades, Russia, it's an opportunity to use, to wear down Russia, and by not being directly involved here. And this is an opportunity for America. This is why people will say America is silly if they don't continue to fund this war. Now, that's not a conspiracy. It's just the way it is. And that's what America deals with. America is, the boss of the world that uphold, what they will, freedom, democracy, what they hold strongly. Therefore, because they're at that number one level, well, they have to maintain that, reach out and try and maintain that, especially where there's other adversaries like this that could have influence on their reach and their effect, especially in West and East Europe. So we're going to go over this from the ISW here as well. And I do find this interesting. Now, this is a couple of days old, but it is still very relevant. So the United States has a much higher stake in Russia's war in Ukraine than most people think. A military conquest of all of Ukraine is by no means impossible if the United States cuts off all military assistance and Europe follows suit. To be honest, I sort of disagree with this. I think if the US cuts off assistance, NATO is too heavily reliant on the US, and a lot of people will bring this forward as a problem, and I completely agree. I think that NATO in and of itself, combining many different countries around the world, shouldn't have this much reliance on the US, that if the US don't want to be involved, that not everything then becomes a sitting duck. There's a heavy reliance there. And a Russian conquest of Ukraine, it's not impossible. It would be inevitable. If Europe and the US pulled funding, it wouldn't be impossible. It would then be inevitable. Russia still has a lot of power and a lot of industry as well. We will speak, and does speak a little bit about this. Now, such an outcome would bring a battered, triumphant Russian army right up to NATO's border, from the Black Sea to the Arctic Ocean, from the south to the north. The Ukrainian military, with Western support, has destroyed nearly 90% of the Russian army that invaded in Feb 22, according to US intelligence sources. We don't know exactly if that is correct, but people have said around 90%, maybe the full-time, some reserves, maybe some units. I doubt that it's at that 90%. The reason I doubt this is if you've got 10% that was left from pre-war and Russia's still making a lot of gains, that's not a great sign either. But like they say, the Russians have replaced that manpower losses and are ramping up their industrial base to make good their material losses at a rate much faster than their pre-war capacity has permitted. And of course, this comes with part of a war. You'll ramp up industry, and we do know that Russia can ramp industry. People say they're out of missiles, they're running out of this. At the end of the day, we need to be realistic about this, that they can ramp up that, and we have seen that. And the replacement of manpower, especially Russia, is absolutely can just call up more and more people. So at the end of the day, we need to be realistic about that. Russia still holds a vast military power. They still have a lot of people in the military. We need to sit there. We can't just go, this is some backwater country with nothing going. It's, whatever, just some random orcs running around. You're going to go, well, why are they still having success on the front line 2 years on and have lost, let's take 90%. If they've lost 90% of hardware, people, whatever, from pre-war, full-time service, and they're still making gains in ground and still able to ramp that material loss, well, we need to go, well, this is something still fucking very serious, like we thought beforehand, and not to downplay. The last thing you want to do is underestimate your enemy. And I think that's what happened with the counteroffensive. A victorious Russian army at the end of the war will be combat experienced and considerably larger than its pre-22 Russian land forces. This is something that we don't have. The Western forces have little to no conventional war experience. This is something we're seeing as a problem as well with the Western forces going to train the Ukrainian soldiers, that, okay, our basic training, infantry, minor tactics may be more developed. The level of actual conventional warfare experience that the West has is very, very little. The Russian economy will gradually recover as sanctions inevitably erode, and Moscow develops ways to circumvent and mitigate those that remain. Now, when this war ends, of course, all these companies, okay, it's going to sound like a prick. Individuals in companies care about other individuals, care about what's right and wrong and war, whatever. Companies as a whole, they care about stock price. The reason a lot of individual companies have pulled out of somewhere like Russia is because it looked really fucking bad for them. Once the war ends, people start moving on. They're not getting called out. I guarantee these companies will go back in. Companies chase stock value, supply, demand, selling things on like that, and as well as the sanctions, as far as actual sanctions against from other countries into Russia, like they've said, they will inevitably erode, and we will see that at the end of the war. Over time, it will replace its equipment and rebuild its coherence, drawing on a wealth of hard-won experience fighting mechanized warfare, something we lack and that they are gaining, although having huge losses. It will bring with it an advanced air defense systems that only American stealth aircraft badly needed to deter and confront China can reliably penetrate. Russia can pose a major conventional military threat to NATO for the first time since the 1990s, in a timeframe set to a considerable extent by how much the Kremlin invests in its military, since Moscow has already committed to an ambitious post-war military expansion program. The US cannot be confident that the timeframe will be long. So saying that they will rebuild into a larger force than they had pre-war and learn from the massive mistakes that Russia had as well there. And speaking about with these advanced air defense systems, that realistically against those, what can go up against the S-300, 400, 500, or 400s, 500s, you're really reliant on your stealth aircraft, F-35, F-22, B-2, and the amount of countries that actually operate stealth aircraft is still limited. Of course, these are still American aircraft. We operate F-35s over here, not in vast numbers, but still an American aircraft, and they're still ironing out some issues on those as far as I'm aware. But the interesting bit in this is, well, if we're saying that up against those systems, they need those, well then, like we've spoken about many times, that should be more of the goal than the F-16 program. How much effect will that actually have may be limited. Anyway, the overall military potential of the United States and its NATO allies is so much greater than that of Russia. There is no reason to doubt the West's ability to defeat any conceivable Russian military, even assuming that Russia fully absorbs Ukraine and Belarus. And this is true. If Russia absorbed Ukraine, Belarus, and this is assuming that they win the war, that the military power is still never going to be, well, not never, for decades, is not going to be the power of what the West have currently. That said, still a very large threat on the border there and a major player in the military space. But as Americans consider the costs of continuing to help Ukraine fight the Russians in the coming years, they deserve a careful consideration of the costs of allowing Russia to win. Those costs are much higher than most people can imagine. To deter and defend against a renewed Russian threat following a full Russian victory in Ukraine, the United States will have to deploy to Eastern Europe a sizable portion of ground forces, so moving people over. Remember, the amount of troops, the amount of aircraft, the amount of tanks, it may be vast, but it is still finite. The United States will have to station in Europe a large number of stealth aircraft. Again, even more finite. In building and maintaining those is intrinsically expensive, but challenges in manufacturing them rapidly will likely force the United States to make a terrible choice between keeping enough in Asia to defend Taiwan and its other Asian allies, us over here, and deterring and defeating a Russian attack on a NATO ally. The entire undertaking will cost a fortune, and the cost will last as long as the Russian threat continues, potentially indefinitely. Stealth aircraft are super expensive and take a long time. So what they're saying is, because, you know, just pumping these, it's not going to be like World War II, so we made 10,000 aircraft in a couple of months. No, it's not going to be that many. So what they're saying here is they're going to have to go, right, well, we've got 200 of these spare. We'd love all 200 over here to defend against China, but fuck, we only have a finite amount. We're going to have some in Eastern Europe because of this. Now it's on the border here. Now, the entire undertaking cost a fortune, and the cost will last as long as the Russian threat continues, potentially indefinitely. Well, if the last decades have ever told us anything, that threat continues. But I think they overestimate the real threat here as well. Like, talking about, you know, does Putin and Russia actually have any interest in NATO? And this is assuming that if Russia push up to there, that the interest is then on NATO. And I think the Russian interest in NATO is slim to none. Putin knows that he has no chance against something like NATO. And I think, to be fair, that Russia has been the boogeyman we sort of needed for the last decades, the one to spin up our military. But I think the Russian boogeyman of, like, this is how powerful it is, that's actually a lot of our own propaganda and mixed with effective Kremlin propaganda. And that has built our forces, our alliances, and maintaining these trillion-dollar militaries. But I think a lot of it is buying into our own propaganda of, we need this because of that threat. Now, I'm not saying we don't need that, but I think we have definitely put over. Now, I'm not talking since 2022. 2022 just disproved a lot of our own intelligence up until that point. But yeah, I think to say that the next step is then into Europe, or into NATO, I should say. I do believe even Putin is like, we don't have that. We don't have that sort of. We don't want that smoke. And Putin has questioned about this only last week. Now, I quote Putin, but still, last week, and he said, questioned about, you know, pushing NATO, it is complete nonsense. And I think President Biden understands that. Russia has no reason, no interest, no geopolitical interest, neither economic, nor political, nor military, to fight with NATO countries. And, well, maybe geographically, yeah, but as far as what would actually, the downfall of that would be just insane for Russia as well. And Putin added that Biden may be trying to stroke such fears to justify his erroneous policy in the region. We did see Putin go that if this money doesn't get across into Ukraine, that next thing we will see American soldiers on the ground, and the last thing we want, and I'm not quoting him directly here, but along the lines of, we'll see American soldiers fighting Russian soldiers. And of course, that is pushing to try and get that money through as well. But I think the actual odds of seeing that, with the way the global war and the military might that all these countries in that region have, I think is still very unlikely. Anyway, back to this. Almost any other outcome of the Ukraine war is preferable to this one. Helping Ukraine keep the lines where they are through continuous Western military support is far more advantageous and cheaper for the United States than allowing Ukraine to lose. And many will say, you think it's expensive to fund Ukraine? Wait for the money if they lose. Freezing the conflict is worse than continuing to help Ukraine fight. That would simply give Russia time and space to prepare for a renewed war to conquer Ukraine and confront NATO. Helping Ukraine regain control of all or most of its territory would be much more advantageous, as it would drive Russian forces even further to the east. Best of all, supporting Ukraine to its victory and then helping rebuild would put the largest and most combat-effective friendly military on the European continent at the forefront of the defence of NATO, whether Ukraine does or does not ultimately join the alliance. That Ukraine currently has the most combat experience in NATO. It just does, at least at the soldiers level there. Yes, it's got their own problems there, but what they're saying is then it would be right on the forefront here. And I do think the ISW somewhat don't do assessing, and they are pushing their own agenda somewhat in some of this, but we're just looking over it, and I think it's interesting to go. In all these scenarios, Americans should keep in mind that Ukraine is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan in 2001 was one of the poorest countries in the world, with no industry to speak of and a poorly educated population. Ukraine is highly industrialized with a modern, urban, and highly educated population. Now, one thing I will say in Afghanistan, when you talk of, you're saying it's poor, little industry, poorly educated. Well, a lot of those reasons for it being like that, people should be looking to the West and Russia as well. So at the time, the Soviet Union, for actually why Afghanistan is like that now, because it wasn't like that previously. And I think, yeah, okay, poorly educated. There are some very, very clever people there as well. And even that has bet Afghanistan has never been conquered. They at the end of the day, oh, they didn't beat us. Well, who fucking still holds it? You know, Ukraine is highly industrialized with modern, urban, and highly educated population. Restored to its 91 borders, Ukraine's economy is large enough to support its own military. Now, in this is doing some assumptions as well about, I guess, population and further funding to rebuild. Ukrainian President Zelensky has recently committed to his country to establishing its own military industry, including by establishing joint ventures with Western firms to benefit Ukrainian partners. We've seen things with Rheinmetall, as well as other industries there in private sector of defense. A victorious Ukraine would not be a permanent ward of the West. It can be instead a truly independent and contribute greatly to NATO's security and the West's economy. The following maps illustrate 4 military situations related to this war and its outcomes to consider their military, strategic, and financial implications to the United States. We're going to look over those maps as well. Now, I do want to talk about, I guess, the further effect in this, what we were just speaking of there, that it doesn't really take into account how Ukraine could be after this war. And of course, that's on a spectrum. It sort of paints as it all sunshine and rainbows. Now, it could be that. It could be that. But Ukraine, let's say the war just ends tomorrow. It's still a heavily armed country with groups that may not like where the state is heading. At the moment, my enemy is my friend. So they turn a blind eye to a lot of these individual groups working, and down to militia forces, all of this. They're trying to get those under control. They really are. But as well as corrupt officials, all of this. Like it or not, it's just part of it. And it's something that Ukraine's going to have to work out at the end of this conflict, wherever it is. And that is going to be a boiling pot at that point in time. And I've had many people say to me that could be potentially an internal conflict to de-arm some of these groups and actually get some of these areas then out of power there. And we don't know also how it's going to look entering these areas like Donetsk, Crimea that have been living under Russia. How's that going to look with the internal politics there as well as the population? This is going to be a real issue with getting people by the millions who left back in. And of course, that has a massive effect on the economic stability of the country as well as Ukraine already had. And Russia's shocking as well as far as their, what's the word I'm looking for, where you repopulate. Their replacement rate is very low, and even worse when you're talking about the young people that have died in this war, sadly, and the young people that have left the country, that those are issues that are going to have to be faced as well. Now, they talk in that about Ukraine needing its own independent military and independent military industry to stand on its own 2 feet. That is, I think, should be one of the biggest priorities for Ukraine, that the Western welfare aid may not last forever, and it's already having kinks in it that it needs to be independent as soon as possible. Now, trying to stand on your own 2 feet with Russia attempting to knock you over, I know it's easier said than done, but it is very, very true. And everyone I speak to, whether they're a soldier through to people that work in these industries, say that should be priority number 1, is they need to get away from this reliance and try and move into independence. And of course, it is incredibly difficult politically, economically, with especially the bloody war going on, but it is very, very important. So let's then have a look at Then this map that the Russians have been building air defense network relying on their advanced S-300-400 long-range anti-aircraft missile system to hinder NATO's ability to defend the Baltic states. They have been expanding the network over much of the Black Sea, using their bases in occupied Crimea. However, the network suffered a large gap across southern Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, because they could not base their systems in Ukraine. Even their air defense coverage over Poland relied heavily on systems in Kaliningrad, the most vulnerable, and exposed part of Russian territory. Of course, Kaliningrad is this little bit that sits out here. Where was I? Kaliningrad's small size deprives Russian air defense systems of one of the important elements of their survivability. In fact, their systems are fully mobile with all their components mounted in trucks. They are designed to be able to move around and thereby make it harder for an adversary to locate and destroy them. Trapping their systems in a small exclave reduces their advantage and facilitates NATO efforts to disrupt and defeat them. So, trying to keep them, Russia want to keep them on the move, moving around. It's hard to defeat these, and like they said, that we'd need, you know, your Gen 4+5 aircraft, and you can just see. So, of course, this is Ukraine sitting right here, and at the moment, this is how it is looking with Russia's air defense systems. Of course, we've seen targeting of them down in Crimea, and their effectiveness has been questioned, and you can see where their air defense can cover over the Baltic states of Poland, Lithuania, but of course, southern Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, basically untouched. And this air defense system, this is why, you know, the US doesn't need all these sort of stealth aircraft in here to defend currently, but we'll go a little bit deeper into how then it would look if Russia fully occupies Ukraine. So this is their hypothetical situation. The estimate of the Russian forces might deploy to Ukraine and Belarus if Moscow intended to be prepared for short notice serious attacks on NATO is very conservative. It assumes that the Russians move to the NATO borders 2 armies new created from the current war, one of which is designated to be stationed in Crimea and deployed to the eastern border. So basically what they're saying in here is that there's a lot of bases and military units that are currently, you know, down along other areas down here that they won't need to be down this border or across here if they are moving through here, if they've got then the borders. The Russians could well bring considerably more combat power toward NATO frontiers than it discussed below, then depicted on this map, following a victory over Ukraine without any strategic cost if they were willing to pay the financial price. The sudden collapse of Western aid would likely lead sooner or later to the collapse of Ukraine's ability to hold off the Russian military. Russian forces could push all the way to western Ukrainian border in such a scenario and establish new military bases on the border of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania. The Russians are preparing military forces to handle the almost inevitable Ukrainian insurgency while leaving frontline troops to threaten NATO. Now, this is something I don't think is talked about enough, and I believe this is a problem for both Ukraine and Russia. Insurgent groups are almost impossible to deal with, to get rid of. Now, look at the IDF and Hamas. Now, currently, the IDF, yes, are having success moving through. Give it a couple of years, and I think Hamas will still exist in pockets, in other elements, as well as further radicalization. It might be a bit different, but insurgency groups, guerrilla forces, almost always succeed in one way or another, and it's almost impossible to deal with. Now, of course, if Russia try and occupy somewhere like Kyiv, Lviv, major cities, Dnipro, Kharkiv, going to be very, very, very difficult with the amount of just weapons, the amount of trained fighters in those regions, and the massive insurgency that will take place there. I've also spoken about, I think this is going to be a bigger problem for Ukraine than people are talking about. If Ukraine do push through Donetsk, Sevastopol, areas like that, that I think this will be a huge issue as well, and something that's going to be very, very difficult to actually deal with. And it's not just a few policemen and this and that. It's going to be a massive, massive issue, headache for whichever country tries to hold a major city. And whether this border goes east or west, one country is going to have to be in charge of one of these cities. And there's a lot of people in areas like Sevastopol, Donetsk, who are not for Ukraine, and nowhere near as many that aren't for Russia in other cities, but you know what I mean. The Russians have expanded their army structure to fight the war and have indicated their intention of retaining larger structure after the war. They want to expand. They could readily station 3 full armies, which are newly created for this war, the 8th combined borders of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania. They would likely build out the component divisions in these armies in normal supplements of 3 regiments each, drawing formations. They could move divisions that have been stationed in the east of Ukraine borders to Ukraine itself. So we've spoken about that, of course, moving them in. And one thing Russia has gotten this, with all their stuff-ups, with all the failed mechanised assaults, failed waves of assaults of men, they have got now experience in mechanised large warfare. We're still seeing a lot of fuck-ups with it, but at the end of the day, experience is experience. The Kremlin has made great strides in its long-term project to gain control over the Belarusian military, and victory in Ukraine would likely get it the rest of the way. So it would become another just country basically inside that. The Russians would thus likely deploy there permanently or in a nominally rotational way airborne division, of course, through Belarus, mechanised inf, VDV, things like this. There would be a threatened short notice mechanised offensive against one or several NATO states with at least 8 divisions. They break it down here. They could make such an attack and still threaten the Baltic states and Finland with the forces already present there and their reinforcers. They have announced they intend to station along the Finnish borders. Russian ground forces would be covered by a dense air defence network of S-300, 400, 500 long-range air defence systems with overlapping coverage of the entire front. So let's have a look then. No, which one are we on? Let's have a quick look here. So they're talking then about this. This is where these air defense systems could fit. And as you can see from the previous map, so this is basically where it's sitting now of these air defense systems. Then we get far more coverage of Eastern Europe down here. And they've talked about then America. NATO would have to have more of those high generation, 5th gen stealth fighters in and around these spots. But let's move on to number 5 because I've got these numbered for a reason. NATO would be unable to defend against such an attack with forces currently in Europe. The United States would need to move large numbers of American soldiers to the entire eastern NATO border from the Baltic to the Black Sea to deter Russian aventurism and prepare to defeat a Russian attack. The US would need to commit a significant proportion of its fleet of stealth attack aircraft permanently to Europe. NATO defence strategy relies on air superiority, not merely to protect NATO troops from any attack, but also the use of air power to offset smaller NATO ground forces by limited stocks of NATO artillery. This is an issue with limited stocks. Of course, these stocks have dropped significantly from the beginning of this war, now sending things even to Israel as well. And some will say, and I agree with this, the West has become, and this is coming from a soldier myself, we're too heavily reliant on technology. We're very reliant on air defense, air superiority, that we basically assume air superiority, and that isn't right. You shouldn't assume that you're going to have air superiority. And we're heavily reliant, I believe as individual soldiers, on technology being in our favour, not knocking out satellites, not having GPS, certain types of communication equipment, certain types of electronic countermeasure, things like this. And let's talk about this, I guess, limited stock of artillery. And I know we're getting a bit long in the tooth on this video, but I've had some very smart people who study war and look at things like this say to me that the plan here for over a decade or more, that the plan isn't a year or two war in Ukraine. It's a very long plan, a long war between Putin and Xi, of course, from China. What they're really wanting to do is deplete NATO stocks and NATO's appetite for war. So the first step of this is what I was being told at least, and you can tinfoil hat. This is all right. This isn't my thing. This is from people, and yeah. Anyway, that this war is to try and deplete both NATO stocks of artillery, moving things around like this, like they're saying in this, and this is put between Putin and Xi. And of course, appetite for war is a big one. People get war fatigue. We're seeing that in the US. People have war fatigue. People don't want more war. And once it's depleted somewhat, that's when China will go in, take Taiwan, do whatever they want to do. And the public support may not be that great there. And as well, I think that idea has at least legs where people are talking about, well, the difference with these leaders, these guys of states where they basically vote themselves in just on and on and on, is they can think further down the line than every 3-4 years, like in a democratic country like this. And I'm a big supporter of democracy, but the problem is every 4 years you can be at threat of being voted out and you've got a campaign, all that. That the actual effect here was to try and reduce the West wanting to go forward in a war. Conspiracy, but it's what I hear from a lot of people, and it has similar, like people have very similar ideas about this. United States would have to keep large numbers of stealth aircraft available in Europe to penetrate and destroy Russian air defense systems, called SEAD indeed, and keep the Russians from re-establishing effective air defense. so that non-stealthy aircraft and cruise missiles can reach their targets. So to take these out for our stuff to go in. The requirement to commit a significant stealth aircraft fleet to Europe could badly degrade America's ability to respond effectively to Chinese aggression against Taiwan, since all Taiwan scenarios rely heavily on the same stealth aircraft that would be needed to defend Europe. This is where people come into the idea that I spoke about. The cost of these defensive measures would be astronomical and would likely be accompanied by a period of very high risk when US forces are not adequately prepared or postured to handle either Russia or China, let alone both together. This goes into what people are saying is maybe this is a plan between the two, and talking about if they had all of this here, that they need far more defense strategy here. They don't have enough currently for both Russia and China. And I think there's a bigger effect here too. Like when we're talking militarily, but I just think as well that with the sort of globalization of the world and the US superiority that it has, and of course US has a lot of security guarantees out there, that if Ukraine lose, that those security guarantees will just mean less, and people may look into other areas. And I think we see this with US's backing of Israel, that other states who are friends with the US are like, well, we don't like that policy. You're voting no against these security guarantees, or vetoing them and pushing other people closer. But I think the US can't afford to lose another war. Anyway, let's move on. We are chewing through time. Notional Russian air defense system dispositions, sorry, if Russia wins. So talking just like we spoke about before. So this then goes into if Ukraine had a full victory. Re-establishing Kyiv's control over Ukraine's territory, including Crimea, is important for the United States and NATO, as well as Ukraine, of course, as well as Ukraine. Russia's possession of Crimea makes Russia the dominant power in the Black Sea and allows Russian aircraft to threaten the southeastern NATO flank, as well as to deploy long-range air defences on the peninsula. So, of course, talking Crimea down here and the southeastern flank of NATO being around here. Now, the positions on the east left bank of Kherson, that's we talk about southern Ukraine where Russia hold, oblasts that Russia currently control, provide bases even further west of Crimea. So, of course, Crimea, their bases further west of Crimea. Where was I? NATO will have to meet these challenges wherever the war ends if those areas remain in Russian hands. If Ukraine regains its 91 borders, however, the pressure on NATO eases dramatically. The nearest Russian troops to Romania would be almost 500 miles away. The Black Sea would become very nearly a NATO lake. Moscow would likely complete its military control of Belarus and its base its forces there even in this scenario. The threat of NATO of such bases, however, would take on a very different cast in a scenario in which Belarus was a large salient with NATO forces on both sides, on two sides, and a large and powerful independent Ukraine all the way along its southern border. So, of course, not just down here, you'd have NATO down here and then across there. The task of defending northeastern Poland and the Baltic states from Russian troops operating out of Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Russia itself is a much more manageable and less costly proposition than that of defending the entire NATO line from the Black Sea to the Arctic Ocean. So that it's much more manageable to do that than try and have ins and outs of where you're actually defending. And then we have a look at where the air defense systems will be in not only Ukraine, but of course then on NATO itself. And this is what I say, whether Ukraine is or not in NATO, this is how the air defense systems will look different. So this is basically where it was sitting. Well, bar this, pre-91, of course, these air defense systems are much more advanced now. They'll still have air defense in the north of Ukraine and in the east of Ukraine, but you look from Poland down to Romania here and especially into the Black Sea, that the control for Russia would be significantly less if Ukraine was able to take back its full borders there. Now, we just read that one. And then we looked at, was it that map we looked at? Yes, it was. Sorry, I'm getting lost. I'm 34 minutes in. Conclusion. This brief paper evaluates only the narrow question of some of the military, strategic, and financial trade-offs in various possible outcomes of the Russian war in Ukraine. Of course, this is a spectrum of where this war is going to end. And I believe, currently, I just believe that the West is not going to supply Ukraine with the amount of aid Ukraine need to take back to its 91 borders. It's just not looking likely. When we're talking tens of billions, that's going to be in the hundreds of billions and more involvement there to actually push through there. At the end of the day, look at how the last 12 months went. You know, you've got 10 Ks in some areas, some villages. Look at Russia's last 12 months. They've got Bakhmut, they've got some other villages, but still very small moves. I don't believe that either Russia or Ukraine currently hold the power to actually achieve either of the goals here. That if we've got taking back 91 here and going to Poland here, that the spectrum in here is somewhere where this war is going to end. We have considered elsewhere the important question of possible Russian escalations in the face of defeat, and we do not minimise these considerations. Of course, escalations, we talk about nuclear weapons as well. We have argued strongly that American values align with American interests in Ukraine, and there is a strong and cogent values-based arguments for helping Ukraine liberate all its land and its people. We still believe that is true, so saying that it's still in America's interest to do this. But the American people are being asked to spend a lot of money helping Ukraine fight Russia, and it is not unreasonable for them to also wonder what the financial cost of not helping Ukraine would be. This essay is meant solely to serve as a departure point for data-driven and realistic discussion to answer that question. I like realistic discussion. And it is true, like they say here, it's not unreasonable for people to go, hang on, we're in a recession, people are struggling to bloody feed their family, and people, and why are we sending tens of billions over here? And it's very easy to measure that cost, and you can't really give a cost on whether that didn't go through. So you can see that's how if you're watching this video 37 minutes in, you know 50 times more than just the average punter about this, and you might go, well, this is obvious, but at the end of the day, it's making some assumptions. But at the end of the day, just the average person trying to push through life, very hard time financially at the moment, of course, and that is where, people will look outwards and go, where the fuck is my money going? And I think it makes a lot of assumptions about how this is going to look after this conflict as well, that like it's one or the other and everyone's happy with this, not with, there might be some elements go, well, we don't want to be liberated, or like Donetsk maybe, and some people in Sevastopol will fight back, guerrilla forces, and will Ukraine get into NATO? How's it going to look after? And is there further escalation somewhere in that, as well as elections, all of that? Now, we're going to have a quick look at some stuff here as we see just the amount of mud and snow building up in Ukraine at the moment. Here we have this Humvee here bogged to its arse. I've had bogged my car like that before. Really, really shit situation here, and we're seeing, because of this sort of mud, we will start seeing the offensives really starting to slow down, and the men living through that, it is a horrible, horrible thing. Now, we are just going to have a look over the maps. Of course, we've looked at about where everything is bloody over the maps we just looked at, but of course the red areas since 22, the purple since 14. Now we're going to come down into Thankyou here, where we do know Ukraine do hold troops over this side. Now we haven't seen any movement here. We have seen failed Russian attempts out of here. Then they got ambushed and taken out to large numbers here. Russian pages will claim they also had they affected large numbers of Ukrainians on this side too, with their artillery, and as well as onto the right bank. Now let's just have a quick look, because I do have an update here from Syriac. Russian-Ukraine War 661, situation on Kherson front. Here, Russian army recovered some parts of Thankyou after weeks of combat with the Ukrainian army. So saying that the combat going on here, that it has actually regained some of that territory. This territory here, I believe, is some of the most important for Ukraine. On a standpoint of geopolitical, financial, economic, the south of Ukraine here, this is incredibly important for Ukraine to get back to still have access then to the Black Sea. Now, we haven't seen anything through Stepove, this region, through to the south of Orokhiv, though we do know Russia made some ground there last week. We haven't seen anything for a long time up around Staromorsky, Makarivka, this area. We haven't seen anything in Ugledar. We know that's been a boiling pot there. Now, let's have a look there at Novomakarivka here. We do have some updates. Now, let's have a look on this map. So 14th to 5th to the 16th, we do see Russia got some ground entering the outer regions of Novomakarivka in here. Let's see if this loads. So just coming up onto some of these small areas that move out. Let's have a look where that moved. So moving up and extending the grey zone, of course, into the centre here, and that fighting ongoing. So I think we've got 2 on this. I've got Novo number 1. So this is the first day of what this was. Let's just bring this up. Southwest Donetsk, Russian army made new advance south of Novomakarivka, so pushing up that first movement, but it, of course, is saying that more hooks around in here. So then let's look at then the next day. So day from 660 to 661. This looks very similar here. Clashes between Russian army and Ukrainian army continue south of Novaklivka, with Russian troops entrenching in the cemetery. So this area right here, this is the cemetery, and it's saying that Russian troops have got this ground up here. A little bit different on the maps, but still very, very similar. Now, Mariinka, what have we seen here? Last time we spoke about that 95% of Mariinka came under Russian control. This may have been the last few percent over those days there. It's mostly then under control. Now let's just clear up my map for me. No, we don't actually have one for that, but it's interesting how Russia has pushed through there. Sorry, I thought we had a Suryk map update there as well. Now we're going to move up into Avdiivka here. Let's just roll back a couple of days, and we see that Russia continues along this road into the center of Avdiivka and out from the north of Vodani or Pitny, that they make ground there, and a tiny bit of ground near Stepove. So still squeezing down on this. Now let's have a look down in the west of Avdiivka near Pervomayevsky here. Let's have a look. So Russia made some ground here as well as along into Pervomayevsky, and that front line just changed slightly in here too. So squeezing on many different aspects here, of course, pushing out in here, and that continues the whole squeeze on this region here. But we have this here as well. So this is to the west of Vodani. This is Pervomayevsky. This is where they're pushing into. So this basically lines up. See where this turns left? That is that left turn. So very line up. That's what we like. Anyway, Russian army made small advances east of Pervomayevsky. So that's what we see right there. I don't actually have one about Novelsky where we see them make some ground there. So let's get rid of that one. So I don't have actually a Suryk update of these other movements we saw, but this of course is the Western Ukrainian map. So if we see Russian movements on that, we can believe it's that or maybe more, if that makes sense. It's like a Russian map. You can believe well, it's actually probably less if they're showing their movement. That's how you sort of deal with it, and making some ground in Stepove as well. Now up in Bakhmut, there are rumor mills through Russian pages that Ukraine is currently pulling out of Kishkivka. We're not really sure, but we have seen Russia make some ground in there. Now let's have a look over the past couple of days. Now we have mainly seen around Kromove, Boronivka, and Hurovka here as well. So have a look, making some ground, of course, on that. You're very familiar with this road. This was the road of life, then into Bakhmut at one point in time. So Bakhmut number 1, Kromove. This is right here. We're talking to this road. Now this is saying that Russia has pushed significantly in along here. So see where this comes out. This is where this water comes out, that they're in more of this region here. Russian army took control of some parts of the Popovsky area. So right up in here, if you believe Suryk maps, it's probably somewhere in between these two. And then more on Bakhmut. Now, this, of course, is down in Klishkivka region. See, it sort of hooks around in here. Russian army begun retaking ground adjacent to the Kodomivka. In addition, Ukrainian army began the withdrawal of some parts of Klishkivka due to intense bombardment that they were pulling out here. And we do know that Russia has brought in a lot of reserves, a lot more troops into both Bakhmut and Avdiivka here. Then now they are on this push through. So we can get rid of those two. And we have one more to talk about in Sinkivka. Now, I don't believe we see any change of the past few days. No, we see a lot of ground near Rozdilivka last week made, but not much now. And then let's have a look here. Of course, this blue means Ukraine made ground in the past couple of weeks. So let's roll back. So we did see, we spoke about last time this push into here, into Sinkivka. Russia had like a failed attack into there, and we broke that down in the last Ukraine video talking about the armoured vehicle movements, and we do see that Russia lost a little bit of ground in here as well, according to the deep state map. We know this is very important because of Kupiansk, the hub for northeastern Ukraine, but this is important for both, well, very important for Ukraine and also important if Russia can get it for their attack as well. Let's have a look what Suryk has said. Situation northeastern front. During the last 4 days, Russian army managed to entrench in northern outskirts of Sinkivka. However, all the attempts to enter in the town were repelled by the Ukrainian army. So let's have a look. This is basically the same area we're talking about. And this is what we saw. We did see the Ukrainian army repel attempts to move into Sinkivka to try and get a foothold in here. And of course, if they can get a foothold here, this will supply a more flanking fire into this heavily wooded area here and threaten Ukraine's way in and out of the trench systems and the build up in there also. But legends, I think that's it. I think we've done everything we needed to do today. I hope you've had a great Monday. Sorry this video really did drag on. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.